There are lots of times that fractions, decimals, and percents are used interchangeably, so it's really helpful to know their equivalents. You might have noticed that in this chart, the fractions are not stacked one over top of the other as they typically are. Your computer skills are probably better than mine. This was just the way that I made it work, so we'll ignore it for now. One of the ones that we're pretty much all familiar with is half. Half, in equivalent percent, is 50%. And its equivalent in decimal is 0 and 5/10. Let's take a look at a quarter, and I'm going to use a 100 grid to help us with this. If we take the halfway mark, there's half, so half's on this side and half's on this side. 1/4 or 1/4 I could have going that way, and we can shade that in by saying this is 1/4 of this. Because this 100 grid represents percent, which means out of 100, all we need to do is to count the number of squares that we've shaded in. We've got 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. And we know that from using money that 25 is 1/4 of $1 or 100 cents. So that'll be 25%. And we know that the decimal equivalent for that will be, just like this is half of 50, half of 5/10. So that will be 2/10 and 5/100, or 25/100. In a similar way, we can take half of this square to make eighths, just like we would if we were folding paper. So we might take 2 rows of this, and then in our 3rd row, we're going to have to cut that last square in half, and we can shade this part in, and that gives us an 1/8. And that will give us 10 of our hundredths, 11, 12 of our hundredths, 12 hundredths, and then a half of 1. So that would be 125 thousandths, or we might say 12.5% or 12.5%. We'll call it 12.5%. Once we know 1/4, it's really easy to figure out 3/4 because it's 3 times as much. So 1/4 would be 25%, 3/4 would be 75%. And 0 and 25 hundredths will be 0 and 75 hundredths. Similarly, we can look at 1/8. This is a little trickier and actually probably easier to go from a whole and merely subtract 125 thousandths. That will give us 875 thousandths, or 87.5%, which is almost the whole thing, just like 7/8 is almost the whole thing. We'll take a new hundreds grid, and because of the structure of the hundreds grid, it will be very easy for us to figure out 1/10. Let's trace out 1/10 of this grid. 1/10 of this grid will be 10 of these hundredths. And that will be 10%. So 10%. And that will give us 0 and 1/10. We could also write that as 10 hundredths, and we know that we can continue to write zeros as long as we want. For now, we will call it 0 and 1/10. Let's say we have 1/5. Well, if we're going to use 1/5, we're going to need 2 bars. So, in this case, we're going to need this much. There's 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, and 5/5. Each of our fifths has 20 of our hundredths in it, or 2/10. So we know that if 1/10 is 10%, 1/5 is twice as much. It's twice as big. And so that will be 20%, or 0 and 2/10. 2/5 will be, you're right, 40%, or 0 and 4/10. 3/5 will be 60%, or 0 and 6/10. And 4/5 will be 80%, or 0 and 8/10. And so we filled in this chart with some commonly used fractions, decimals, and percents. You might want to build a chart like this of your own and think of some other fractions, decimals, and percents that you can use, and then they can be used to solve problems.